Paris, 1928. A dinner party in the 6th arrondissement, candles burning low, the table scattered with wine bottles and cigarette ash. Nancy Cunard sits among poets and painters, her arms stacked with African ivory bracelets from wrist to elbow. She is 32 years old, beautiful in the sharp-boned way that photographs well, and she is talking about Aragon, about her press, about the latest manifesto. Someone laughs. Someone refills her glass. Across the room, a man watches her with the expression people wear when they cannot tell if what they are seeing is freedom or performance. She was born into one of England's wealthiest families, shipping fortunes, estates, a mother who collected famous men the way others collected paintings. By the time Nancy arrived at this dinner party, she had already fled one life and believed she had built another. But the candles were burning down and the bracelets were heavy, and in the morning she would wake alone in a rented room with a headache that no amount of money could cure. This is not a story about a woman who escaped her circumstances. It is a story about what followed her. We begin at the beginning with a child born into wealth so vast it eliminated every problem except the ones it created. Nancy Clara Cunard arrived on March 10, 1896, in Neville Holt, Leicestershire, a sprawling country estate with more rooms than her parents would ever occupy at once. The house had been in the family less than a decade, purchased with Cunard Line money, the shipping empire her grandfather had built, carrying passengers and cargo across the Atlantic. By the time Nancy drew her first breath, the family name meant something. It opened doors. It commanded deference. It bought silence. Her father, Sir Bache Cunard, was a baronet who preferred horses to people. He spent his days at the stables or the hunt, his evenings in clubs where men spoke little and drank steadily. He had married for connection, for the preservation of a certain kind of life, and having done so, he saw no reason to alter his routines. Nancy would grow up seeing him at breakfast if he was home, and sometimes at dinner if there were guests. He was polite to her in the way one is polite to a distant relative's child. Her mother was born Maud Burke, an American who had clawed her way into English society through beauty, charm, and relentless ambition. She changed her name to Emerald after Nancy's birth. Maud sounded too plain, too tied to the Nevada mining town where she had spent her childhood. Emerald Cunard wanted to be remembered, and she would be, but not for motherhood. She collected artists, writers, musicians. She hosted salons. She had affairs that everyone knew about and no one mentioned directly. Her drawing room was famous. Her daughter was an inconvenience. Nancy was raised by nannies in the upper floors of Neville Holt, in rooms that overlooked the gardens but felt far from the house's center. The nannies changed. Some were kind, some were cold, all were temporary. Nancy learned early that attachment was a miscalculation. She learned to be quiet when her mother had guests, to be presented when required, clean dress, brushed hair, a curtsy, and then dismissed. She learned that love, if it existed, was something performed for audiences, not given in private. At 4 years old, she wrote her mother a letter. The handwriting was large and unsteady, the spelling approximate. She asked when they might spend an afternoon together, just the two of them. Emerald read it at breakfast, smiled, and set it aside. There is no record of a response. The estate itself was beautiful in the way that wealth makes things beautiful, manicured, controlled, empty of anything that might surprise. Nancy wandered its gardens alone, trailed by whichever nanny had been assigned to her that season. She played with toys that arrived from London shops chosen by people who did not know her. Birthdays were marked with parties that other children attended, events organized by staff, her mother appearing briefly to be photographed and praised for her generosity. At 6, Nancy was taught French by a governess who had once worked for a family in Paris. The lessons took place in the morning room, away from wherever Emerald was holding court. Nancy was quick with languages, quicker than the governess expected. She memorized vocabulary, repeated phrases until her accent softened. But there was no one to speak to. Her father did not care for French. Her mother used it only to show off at dinners. The skill sat inside her, unused, like the rooms on the 3rd floor that no one entered. She began to understand, without anyone explaining it, that Neville Holt was not a home. It was a stage. Her mother performed there. Her father retreated from it. She was part of the scenery, necessary for the image of a complete family, irrelevant to its actual function. The staff were kind to her in careful, measured ways. They could not afford to be otherwise, but they also could not afford to become too close. Children in houses like this learned not to expect too much from anyone. When Nancy was 7, Emerald took her to London for the first time. They stayed in the family's townhouse in Grosvenor Square, and Nancy was fitted for dresses at a shop where the women spoke in whispers and pinned fabric around her like she was a doll. Emerald sat in a chair by the window, approving colors, dismissing cuts. She did not ask Nancy what she liked. Afterward, they returned to the townhouse, and Emerald left for a dinner party. Nancy ate alone in the nursery and looked out at the square below, at the carriages and the people who seemed to be going somewhere. Back at Neville Holt, the isolation resumed. Her father's foxhounds bayed in the kennels. Her mother's friends arrived and departed. Nancy read in the library when no one needed the room, books she chose herself because no one told her what to read. She found poetry, Shelley, Keats, and copied lines into a notebook. The words felt large and serious, full of emotion she recognized but could not name. She did not show the notebook to anyone. At 9, she asked her nanny why her mother never came to say goodnight. The nanny, a woman named Miss Scarth, who had been with the family for 2 years, hesitated. Then she said, "Your mother is very busy, dear. She has many responsibilities." Nancy did not ask again. She had learned that certain questions made adults uncomfortable, and that discomfort led to distance, and distance was already everywhere. The wealth that surrounded her was not explained. It simply was. The house, the horses, the silver, the paintings, the estate, none of it required justification. Money arrived from somewhere she did not see, managed by people she did not meet, and it ensured that her material needs were never unmet. She had dresses and dolls and books and writing lessons. She had everything except the thing she had begun, without fully realizing it, to stop expecting. By the time she was 10, Nancy had developed a stillness that adults mistook for good behavior. She did not cry when her mother forgot her birthday. She did not protest when her father left for weeks at a time. She watched and she remembered, and she began to understand that beauty and wealth and manners were not shields against loneliness. They were its architecture. Neville Holt stood solid and grand in the Leicestershire countryside, its windows gleaming, its grounds impeccable. Inside, a girl grew up learning that she was both essential and unnecessary, required for the family portrait, irrelevant to its happiness. Emerald Cunard did not dislike her daughter. She simply had no use for her. By the time Nancy turned 11, this distinction had become the organizing principle of their relationship. Emerald needed Nancy to exist. A daughter confirmed one's legitimacy as a woman of society, proved that one had fulfilled certain obligations. But she did not need Nancy to be present. The child was evidence of something already accomplished, and Emerald had moved on to other projects. Those projects consumed her. She wanted to be more than wealthy. She wanted to be necessary. She cultivated friendships with composers, conductors, writers, anyone whose talent might reflect well on her patronage. She filled her London drawing room with people who mattered, or who might matter, or who at least gave the impression of mattering. She gave money to opera houses. She attended premieres. She engineered introductions. Her ambition was tireless and specific. She would be remembered as a woman of culture, not merely a woman of wealth. Nancy, watching from the margins, learned that her mother's affection was a limited resource, distributed according to calculations Nancy could not quite decipher. Emerald praised her daughter in front of guests, her beauty, her manners, her French, but these praises were brief and transactional, deployed to demonstrate Emerald's own success as a mother. In private, Emerald barely spoke to her. When she did, it was to issue corrections. Nancy's posture needed improvement. Her hair should be arranged differently. Her dress was wrong for the occasion. At 12, Nancy began trying in earnest. She thought if she could only become what her mother wanted, the distance might close. She practiced piano for hours, knowing Emerald valued musical ability. She read the books Emerald's friends discussed at dinner parties, hoping to join conversations. She studied her mother's movements, the way she held a teacup, the precise angle of her head when she laughed, the tone she used with important guests, and tried to replicate them. It did not work. Emerald noticed the efforts in the way one notices a servant who has polished the silver particularly well. A brief nod, perhaps, but no real acknowledgement. Nancy was doing what was expected. That was not the same as being exceptional. And Emerald had no patience for the merely expected, not in her own daughter. The comparison was always there, unspoken but unmistakable. Emerald had made herself from nothing, a girl from Nevada who had married into English aristocracy, who had transformed Maud into Emerald, who had forced London society to accept her through sheer determination. Nancy had been born into what Emerald had fought for. She had been given everything, and Emerald seemed to resent her for it. In 1909, when Nancy was 13, Emerald began an affair with the novelist George Moore. It was not her first affair, but it was the most public, the most consuming. Moore was Irish, difficult, brilliant in the way that excused bad behavior. He moved into the periphery of the family's life, present at dinners, weekends, holidays. Nancy's father said nothing. He had long since retreated into his own routines, his own affairs, his own indifference. The marriage had become a fiction maintained for tax purposes and inheritance law. Moore noticed Nancy in a way that made her uncomfortable. He watched her at meals, made comments about her appearance that felt too specific, too lingering. Emerald either did not notice or did not care. She was too absorbed in Moore's novels, his opinions, his moods. Nancy learned to avoid rooms where he might be alone. She learned to leave dinners early, to plead headaches, to make herself scarce. No one intervened. The staff knew better than to comment on household arrangements. Her father was absent. Her mother was occupied. Nancy's discomfort was her own problem to solve, and she solved it by disappearing as much as possible, into books, into long walks on the estate, into silence. At 14, she tried once more. She wrote her mother a poem, carefully crafted, revised over days, copied in her best handwriting. It was about the gardens at Neville Holt, about beauty and solitude, about things she could not say directly. She left it on Emerald's dressing table and waited. 3 days passed. Emerald said nothing. Nancy found the poem later, crumpled in a wastebasket in her mother's room. Whether Emerald had read it or discarded it immediately, Nancy never learned. That same year, Emerald began preparing Nancy for her debut into society. This required effort, attention, planning. Not because Emerald suddenly cared about Nancy's happiness, but because a daughter's successful launch reflected on the mother. Emerald hired tutors for dancing, deportment, conversation. She took Nancy to dressmakers in London, to milliners, to jewelers. She critiqued every choice Nancy made, every preference she expressed. The goal was not to help Nancy become herself. The goal was to shape Nancy into something presentable, marketable, appropriate. Nancy complied. She had learned by now that resistance brought only more coldness, and the coldness was already unbearable. She stood still while dresses were fitted. She memorized the steps of waltzes and quadrilles. She practiced small talk with her tutors, learning to seem interested without saying anything interesting, to deflect attention while drawing just enough of it to be considered successful. But something inside her was hardening. She watched her mother manipulate conversations, deploy charm like a weapon, collect people and discard them when they ceased to be useful. She watched George Moore, still hovering at the edges of their lives, still making Nancy feel like something he was appraising. She watched her father, who had perfected the art of being present without being there at all. By 15, Nancy had stopped trying to win her mother's love. She understood now that it was not a matter of effort or worthiness. Emerald was incapable of giving what Nancy needed or unwilling. The distinction no longer mattered. What mattered was survival. And survival meant learning to perform the role assigned to her, while protecting whatever part of herself remained unperformed. She stood in front of mirrors in expensive dresses and saw a stranger. She sat at dinner tables surrounded by her mother's brilliant friends and felt profoundly alone. She had everything a girl in her position was supposed to want, and none of it touched the emptiness that had been there since childhood, widening with every year, every failed attempt at connection, every moment of her mother's studied indifference. Neville Holt prepared for Nancy's debut. The invitations would go out soon. Emerald was already planning the event, already calculating how it would enhance her own reputation. Nancy would wear white, smile correctly, dance with the right young men, and become what she had always been, proof of her mother's success and nothing more. In 1911, at 15, Nancy was sent away. Not as punishment. Her behavior had been impeccable, her compliance total, but as the next necessary step in her preparation for marriage. Emerald had selected a finishing school in Munich, one that catered to daughters of wealthy English families, and promised to polish whatever rough edges remained. Nancy would learn German, refine her French, study art history and music appreciation. She would return ready for presentation, for courtship, for the transaction that would close this chapter of her life and open the next. The school occupied a large house in the Schwabing district, all high ceilings and dark wood paneling. 30 girls lived there, aged 14 to 18, supervised by Fräulein Hoffmann, a woman whose severity masked what Nancy would later recognize as complete intellectual emptiness. The curriculum was designed not to challenge, but to decorate. The girls studied enough to seem educated without becoming truly educated. A dangerous thing, Fräulein Hoffmann explained, for young women of their station. Nancy shared a room with 2 English girls, Constance and Beatrice, both daughters of men with titles and dwindling fortunes. They talked endlessly about the season, about which families would host the best balls, about which young men were worth pursuing. They practiced conversation, but only certain kinds. How to compliment without seeming eager, how to express interest without seeming intelligent, how to be memorable without being remarkable. Nancy listened and learned that what she had experienced at Neville Holt was not unique. These girls had been raised the same way, for the same purpose. The classes were shallow by design. Art history meant memorizing names and dates, not understanding movements or ideas. Literature meant reading approved novels and agreeing with approved interpretations. Music meant learning to play the piano well enough to entertain guests at a drawing room recital, but not so well that one might be mistaken for someone who needed to perform for money. Everything was aimed at creating wives who could host dinners, manage households, and reflect well on their husband's status. But Munich itself offered something the curriculum did not. On Sunday afternoons, the girls were permitted to walk in the city, chaperoned, in groups of no fewer than 4. Nancy went to museums, the Alte Pinakothek, the Neue Pinakothek, and stood in front of paintings while her classmates grew bored and wandered toward the exit. She found herself drawn to works that her teachers had barely mentioned, paintings that seemed to ask questions rather than answer them. She stayed as long as the chaperone allowed, then returned reluctantly to the school. She began slipping away. Not far, not often, just small rebellions, brief disappearances. She found a bookshop near Ludwigstrasse where the owner spoke French and did not ask questions. She bought books that were not on any approved list. Baudelaire, Rimbaud, poetry that dealt with subjects her finishing school pretended did not exist. She read them in her room after lights out by candlelight, hiding them under her mattress when she heard Fräulein Hoffmann's footsteps in the hall. Constance noticed. One night, after Nancy had tucked the book away and blown out the candle, Constance's voice came from across the dark room. "You're wasting your time." Not cruel, just factual. None of it will matter. You'll marry someone suitable, and that will be that. The rest is just decoration. Nancy did not answer, but she kept reading. In the spring of 1912, Nancy turned 16. Her mother sent a brief letter. No gift, just instructions for the summer. Nancy would return to London for the season, attend certain events, meet certain people. Emerald had already begun making arrangements. There was a young man, an honorable. His family needed money and would be open to discussions. Nancy read the letter twice, then put it in a drawer, and did not reply. The German lessons were taught by Herr Keller, an elderly man who had once been a university professor before an unnamed scandal had relegated him to teaching schoolgirls. He was the only instructor who seemed aware that education might involve actual thinking. During one lesson, he assigned the girls to read Goethe's Faust in the original German. Most of them struggled through the first pages and gave up. Nancy read the entire thing. She wrote an essay about Faust's bargain, about what he had traded and what he had gained. She wrote about desire and knowledge and the cost of getting what you wanted. Herr Keller returned it to her with a single comment in the margin. "You understand more than you should need to." She did not know what he meant, but the word stayed with her. By her final term, Nancy had developed a reputation among the other girls. She was polite but distant, beautiful but strange. She did not participate in their endless strategizing about marriage prospects. She did not seem interested in the things they were interested in. At night, while they discussed engagements and trousseaux, Nancy read Verlaine and memorized lines about decay and beauty and time running out. Fräulein Hoffmann called her to the office one afternoon in May. Nancy sat in the chair across from the desk and waited. The headmistress looked at her for a long moment, then said, "You have all the tools you need. I hope you will use them wisely." It was not a compliment. It was a warning. Nancy left Munich in June 1913, just before her 17th birthday. She had spent 2 years learning to seem cultured without being curious, educated without being intellectual, refined without being independent. She had learned which subjects were appropriate for conversation and which were not. She had learned how to arrange flowers, how to plan a menu, how to manage servants, how to be gracious to guests she found insufferable. But she had also learned other things, things the school had not intended to teach. She had learned that the world contained ideas larger than the ones permitted in drawing rooms. She had learned that beauty could be violent and truth could be ugly. She had learned that there were people who wrote about desire and death and God and nothingness, and that these people were not discussed in polite society because polite society was afraid of them. The train carried her back to England, back to Neville Holt, back to her mother's plans. Nancy watched the German countryside disappear and felt something close to grief. Not for Munich, she had been lonely there too, but for the possibility that education might have been something other than preparation for a life she did not want. She arrived home on a bright summer afternoon. Emerald greeted her in the entrance hall, looked her over with an appraising eye, and said, "Good, you're ready." Nancy did not ask what she was ready for. She already knew. The war arrived in August 1914, and with it came a permission Nancy had not known she was waiting for. The old rules, the careful choreography of society, the endless preparation for marriage, all of it fractured when the first men left for France. England needed nurses, ambulance drivers, volunteers. Women who had been raised to do nothing useful suddenly had the opportunity to do something, even if that something was only adjacent to actual freedom. Nancy was 18. Emerald had planned another season, another round of introductions and balls and orchestrated encounters with suitable men. But the ballrooms were emptying. The young men were leaving, and the mothers were sending their daughters to nursing courses instead of dancing lessons. Even Emerald had to adjust. She threw herself into war work, or rather into the social performance of war work. She organized charity events, hosted fundraisers, opened Neville Holt to convalescing officers. She did not nurse them herself, but she made certain everyone knew the house was available. Nancy volunteered as a nurse's aide at a London hospital. She had no training, no particular skill, but neither did most of the other women who arrived in the first months of the war. They were taught to change bandages, empty bedpans, roll cigarettes for men who could not use their hands. The work was menial, unglamorous, and nothing like the noble sacrifice depicted in recruitment posters. Nancy was assigned to a ward of men with minor injuries, broken bones, infections, illnesses contracted in the trenches. The seriously wounded, the ones missing limbs or faces, were kept in different wards, away from the volunteer ladies. She worked 3 days a week. The rest of the time she returned to Grosvenor Square, to the townhouse, where Emerald hosted dinners that now carried the additional moral weight of being fundraisers. Nancy attended these dinners in the evenings, still wearing her hospital uniform if she timed it right, and watched her mother's friends perform their concern for the war effort while drinking champagne and discussing which composers were still performing, despite the unpleasantness. At the hospital, Nancy met a woman named Helen, a doctor's daughter who volunteered on the same ward. Helen was 23, self-possessed in a way that Nancy envied. She had been educated at Girton College, Cambridge, one of the women's colleges, and spoke about literature and politics as though her opinions mattered. She did not perform deference. She did not soften her intelligence. Nancy had never met a woman like her. They began spending time together outside the hospital. Helen took Nancy to a bookshop in Bloomsbury, where writers and intellectuals gathered, where conversations happened in corners and no one seemed to care about titles or family names. Nancy listened more than she spoke. She was aware that she knew less than she had believed, that her education had left enormous gaps that everyone here seemed to take for granted should not exist. Helen lent her books, H.G. Wells, Bernard Shaw, books about socialism and women's suffrage, and the failures of empire. Nancy read them secretly, the way she had read Baudelaire in Munich, but now the secrecy felt less like protection and more like shame. She was 19 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and just beginning to understand how deliberately she had been kept ignorant. In the spring of 1915, Emerald informed Nancy that she was engaged, not proposed to, engaged. The young man was Sidney Fairbairn, the heir to a respectable family with military connections. He was 28, pleasant enough, and willing. Emerald had negotiated the terms with Sidney's father over several dinners. Nancy's considerable dowry would solve certain financial difficulties the Fairbairn family faced. In exchange, Nancy would marry into a family with impeccable social standing. Everyone would benefit. Sidney called on her the following week. They took tea in the drawing room at Grosvenor Square, chaperoned by one of Emerald's friends. Sidney talked about his regiment, about the war, about the house he would inherit someday. He asked Nancy nothing about herself. He seemed to assume that her agreement had already been secured, which it had, just not by him. Nancy did not refuse. She did not know how to refuse. The machinery of her life had been set in motion long before she had developed the ability to resist it. She had been raised to comply, and compliance was what she offered. But something had shifted. The hospital, Helen, the books, the conversations in Bloomsbury, they had shown her that other lives were possible, even if they were not possible for her. The wedding was set for November 1916. The war would be over by then, everyone said, though by 1916 no one believed it anymore. Nancy spent the months before the wedding in a state of careful numbness. She attended fittings, approved flowers, accepted congratulations. She saw Sidney occasionally. He was stationed in England training new recruits, and each visit confirmed what she already knew. He did not love her. She did not love him. That was not the point. Helen tried to talk to her. They met for lunch in October, and Helen said directly, "You don't have to do this." Nancy looked at her across the table and felt a wave of something close to rage. Of course she had to do this. Helen, with her Cambridge education and her doctor father and her confidence, did not understand. Nancy had no profession, no income of her own, no way to survive without her family's money, and her family's money came with conditions. She married Sidney Fairbairn on November 15, 1916, at the Guards Chapel in London. Emerald had orchestrated every detail. The ceremony was tasteful, appropriate for wartime. No excess, but no shortage of elegance either. Nancy wore white. Sidney wore his uniform. The guests included families whose sons were dying in France, and everyone pretended this was a joyful occasion. At the reception, Nancy drank more champagne than she should have. She watched Emerald move through the crowd, accepting compliments, basking in the success of having married her difficult daughter to a suitable man. She watched her father, who had appeared for the ceremony and would disappear again immediately after. She watched Sidney, who was talking to his friends and barely looking at her. The war continued. Men died in numbers too large to comprehend, and Nancy Cunard, now Nancy Fairbairn, left the reception on her wedding night and understood that she had traded one form of imprisonment for another. The difference was that this one came with a husband, and the door had just locked behind her. Sidney Fairbairn's family had a house in Oxfordshire, but he was rarely there. His regiment kept him stationed in various camps across England throughout 1917, and Nancy lived alone in London, in a flat Emerald had arranged near Grosvenor Square. The arrangement suited both of them. Sidney visited when he had leave, a weekend here, a few days there, and they maintained the appearance of a marriage without the substance of one. He was not cruel. That would have been easier to define, easier to name as a reason for leaving. He was simply absent, even when physically present. He talked about military logistics, about men he commanded, about strategy and supply lines. He never asked what Nancy did with her time. When they went to bed, he performed his marital duty with the same efficiency he brought to military planning. Brief, mechanical, concluded. Afterward, he fell asleep immediately. Nancy lay awake in the dark, listening to him breathe, and wondered if this was what the rest of her life would be. She returned to volunteer work, but the hospital felt different now. The wards had filled with men who would never fully recover. Amputees, men with shell shock who screamed in their sleep, men who had been gassed and could not stop coughing. The cheerful patriotism of 1914 had curdled into something harder to name. Nancy changed bandages and emptied bedpans and tried not to think about the fact that Sydney was training men to join them. Helen had moved away, taken a position with a Quaker relief organization in France. They exchanged letters, but the correspondence felt thin, inadequate. Nancy wanted to write about the loneliness of her marriage, about the trap she had walked into with open eyes, but she could not find language that did not sound like self-pity. She was wealthy, safe, untouched by the war in any material way. Her unhappiness was not worth documenting. In April 1917, Sydney came home on a 3-day leave. He seemed distracted, irritable. At dinner the first night, he drank too much and told Nancy that his father was pressuring him about an heir. "We've been married 6 months," he said, not looking at her. "People are beginning to ask." Nancy understood what he meant. She was not pregnant, and this was becoming a problem. Not for them, but for the families who had arranged the marriage. That night, he was rougher than usual, not violent, but insistent, as though he could solve the problem through sheer determination. Nancy closed her eyes and thought about other things. The bookshop in Bloomsbury, the paintings in Munich, anything that was not this. When he finished, he rolled away and said, "We'll keep trying." As though she were a lock, he had not yet figured out how to pick. She did not become pregnant. Month after month, she waited for the sign that never came. She felt relief and, underneath it, fear. Her value to the Fairbairn family was specific and measurable. She had brought money, and she was expected to produce children. She had delivered on the first. Her failure on the second was becoming conspicuous. Emerald noticed. In June, over tea at Grosvenor Square, she asked, delicately, as delicate as Emerald ever managed, whether Nancy had consulted a doctor. Nancy said no. Emerald suggested it would be wise. There were specialists, discreet men who dealt with these matters. Women of their class did not simply accept infertility. They solved it. Nancy did not see a specialist. She knew, though she told no one, that the problem might not be medical. Sydney visited so rarely, stayed so briefly, that the opportunities for conception were limited. But she could not say this to Emerald without admitting that her marriage was a facade, and facades were all her mother understood. By the autumn of 1917, Nancy had begun spending more time away from the flat. She went to galleries, museums, anywhere she could be alone in public. She started attending lectures at the Poetry Bookshop on Devonshire Street, events where writers read their work to small audiences. She sat in the back and listened to men, always men, read poems about the war, about loss, about landscapes destroyed. Some of it was good. Most of it was not. But it was something other than the emptiness of her marriage. She met Iris Tree at one of these readings. Iris was the daughter of the actor Herbert Beerbohm Tree, a young woman who wrote poetry and painted and seemed utterly unconcerned with what anyone thought of her. She wore eccentric clothes, laughed too loudly, and spoke to Nancy as though they were already friends. "You look miserable," Iris said after the reading without preamble. "Come have a drink." They went to a pub near Russell Square. Iris ordered gin for both of them and talked without stopping. About her work, about the absurdity of the war, about a trip she was planning to Italy after everything ended. Nancy listened and felt something loosen inside her. Iris did not ask about Nancy's husband, her family, her marriage. She seemed to assume that Nancy, like her, was simply a person moving through the world on her own terms. It was a fiction, but Nancy clung to it. Through Iris, she met others. Young writers, artists, people who gathered in smoky rooms and argued about art and politics and meaning. They were not wealthy, most of them. They worked. They struggled. They lived in cheap flats and borrowed money and treated poverty as a temporary inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. Nancy envied them in a way that felt almost physical. They had nothing, and yet they had something she did not, the ability to choose their own failures. She began lying to Sydney. When he asked how she spent her days, she told him about volunteer work, about lunches with appropriate friends. She did not mention the pubs, the readings, the hours spent in Iris's studio watching her paint. Sydney did not press for details. He seemed relieved that she had found ways to occupy herself. In December, the Fairbairn family came to London for Christmas. Nancy hosted a dinner, her first as a married woman, at the flat. Sidney's mother, a woman named Constance who wore pearls and judgment in equal measure, asked pointed questions about Nancy's health, her habits, her understanding of her responsibilities. Sidney's father said little, but his silence was its own form of assessment. They were evaluating their investment, and Nancy was coming up short. After they left, Sidney poured himself a whiskey and stood by the window. "They're disappointed," he said, still not looking at her. Nancy waited for him to continue, but he did not. He finished his drink, went to bed, and in the morning returned to his regiment. Nancy stood alone in the flat and understood that the marriage was not failing. It had never been anything to fail. It was a contract, and she had not fulfilled her end. The consequences of that failure had not yet arrived, but they were coming. The war ended in November 1918, and by March 1919, Nancy had left England. Not permanently, at least not in any way she announced to Sidney or Emerald, but with enough finality that her departure felt like an escape. She took rooms in Paris in the 6th arrondissement, on the Rue Guénégaud near the Seine. The rooms were small, poorly heated, nothing like what she had grown up with. She paid the rent herself, using money from a trust her grandfather had established. It was the first time she had ever signed a lease, the first time her name alone had secured anything. Sidney had not objected to her leaving. By early 1919, the fiction of their marriage had become too thin to maintain even for appearances. They had been living separately for months, seeing each other only when family obligations demanded it. Nancy was still not pregnant. Sidney's family had moved from disappointment to quiet hostility. When Nancy told him she was going to Paris to study French literature, he simply nodded. The relief on his face was unmistakable. 6 months later, they would begin divorce proceedings. Neither would contest it. Paris in 1919 was full of people trying to forget what had just happened. The city had survived the war physically intact, unlike so much of France, and that survival had created a strange energy, part celebration, part denial, part desperate forward motion. Cafes filled every night. Artists and writers congregated in Montparnasse in the 6th, arguing about movements and manifestos. Americans arrived, poets and painters fleeing prohibition and Puritanism. The whole city felt like it was performing rebirth. Nancy believed she was part of it. She cut her hair short, a scandal among the women she had known in London, and bought clothes from small boutiques that catered to artists rather than aristocrats. She spent her days wandering museums, her evenings in cafes, her nights at parties in studios where people drank cheap wine and talked about Dada and Cubism and the death of the old world. She felt certain she had left her old life behind, that geography had accomplished what will alone could not. But money followed her. It always did. The trust provided enough that she never had to worry about rent, never had to choose between eating and buying books, never had to make the kinds of calculations that shaped the lives of the artists she befriended. She could afford to be bohemian because she could afford to stop being bohemian whenever she wanted. The others knew this, even if they did not say it directly. She was welcomed, but carefully, the way one welcomes someone who is visiting a life rather than living it. She met Ezra Pound in the spring of 1920 at a gathering in a studio on the Rue de l'Ombre. He was 34, married and utterly convinced of his own importance. He held court in the center of the room, talking about poetry and economics and the collapse of civilization, and Nancy listened as though he were revealing sacred truths. He noticed her, beautiful, attentive, clearly wealthy, and within weeks they were involved. Not a relationship, exactly, more a collision of needs she did not fully understand yet. Pound introduced her to the machinery of literary Paris, the editors, the publishers, the writers who mattered, and the ones who wanted to. Nancy absorbed it all, eager to be useful, to be part of something that felt significant. She hosted dinners, bought drinks, provided introductions. She had learned from watching Emerald that patronage was a form of currency, and here she could spend it on people who seemed to value art rather than opera, rebellion rather than respectability. Through Pound, she met Louis Aragon. He was French, a poet, part of the surrealist movement that was beginning to take shape in Paris. He was 23, 7 years younger than Nancy, and he looked at her in a way that made her feel seen rather than appraised. They became lovers within a month. Pound did not seem to care, or perhaps he had moved on himself. These arrangements were casual, frequently renegotiated, part of the performance of living freely. Aragon wrote poems about her. He called her his Anglaise, his English muse, and she let herself believe that his desire was for her rather than what she represented: beauty, wealth, access to a world he was trying to enter. He took her to surrealist gatherings, to meetings where André Breton held forth on automatism and dreams and the overthrow of bourgeois reality. Nancy sat among them, the only woman, the only one who could pay for the wine, and told herself she belonged. But she was performing. They all were. The artistic poverty, the rejection of materialism, the celebration of chaos. It only worked if you had something to reject. Nancy could play at bohemianism because Neville Holt still existed, because Emerald's money still flowed through trusts and investments, because at any moment she could choose to stop. The others could sense this, even if they pretended not to. She was tolerated, desired, useful. She was not one of them. By 1921, Aragon's attention had begun to wander. He was writing more, drinking more, spending time with Breton and the others in ways that excluded her. Nancy tried to hold on. More dinners, more gifts, more availability. But the tighter she held, the faster he slipped away. She had done this before, with her mother, and the pattern was repeating. She offered herself, and in return, received diminishing interest. When Aragon finally left her for another woman, a French actress with no money and no aristocratic baggage, Nancy convinced herself it did not matter. There were other men, other poets, other chances to be someone's muse. She began an affair with a sculptor, then a journalist, then a minor novelist whose name would not survive the decade. She moved through them quickly, seeking something she could not name, leaving before she could be left. Paris had not freed her. It had simply provided new scenery for the same patterns, new men to repeat old mistakes with. She was still trying to earn love through usefulness, still offering herself to people who wanted something from her, but not her. The rooms on Rue Guénégaud felt less charming now, more like what they were: temporary, rented, cold in winter. She began drinking more. Not enough to be a problem, not yet, but enough to soften the edges of her loneliness, to make the parties feel less performative, to quiet the voice that kept asking what she was doing here, what she thought she would find, what she had actually escaped. The wine in Montparnasse was cheap and plentiful, and no one commented when she reached for another glass. Excess was expected, celebrated even. It was part of the aesthetic. By 1922, Nancy had been in Paris for 3 years. She spoke fluent French now, knew the right cafes, the right galleries, the right people. She had a reputation, beautiful, eccentric, generous with money and attention. But she had not written anything, had not created anything, had not become anything except a wealthy woman who paid for artists to tolerate her presence. The freedom she thought she had found was another kind of cage, just prettier, just harder to see. The sculptor was Constantin Brancusi. Nancy met him in 1922 at his studio on the Impasse Ronsin. She had been invited by a mutual acquaintance, someone who thought Nancy might be interested in buying a piece. The studio was spare, dusty, filled with works in various stages of completion. Smooth forms carved from marble and wood, shapes that suggested birds and columns and bodies without depicting them directly. Brancusi was 46, Romanian, and moved through the space with the assurance of someone who had long ago stopped caring what anyone thought of his work. He looked at Nancy the way he looked at his sculptures, assessing form, searching for some quality beneath the surface. She felt exposed and, strangely, relieved. Most men looked at her and saw wealth or beauty or access. Brancusi seemed to see something else, though she could not have said what. They became lovers within weeks. He did not pursue her. She pursued him. She visited the studio repeatedly, bought a small sculpture she did not particularly want, asked questions about his process. He answered briefly, without elaboration, and returned to his work. His indifference fascinated her. She had spent years seeking attention from men who gave it too freely or withheld it strategically. Brancusi simply did not care, and that lack of care felt like solidity. The affair lasted 6 months. She spent nights in his studio, sleeping on a narrow cot while he worked into the early morning. He carved and polished, stopped occasionally to make coffee or roll a cigarette, barely spoke. Nancy watched him and tried to understand what it meant to be consumed by work, to care about something more than you cared about your own comfort or anyone else's opinion. She had never felt that way about anything. He did not write poems about her. He did not introduce her to important people or take her to gatherings. When she asked if he would sculpt her, he said no without explanation. She pressed him once. Why not? And he looked at her for a long moment before returning to his work. "You are not still," he said finally. She did not know what he meant, but it felt like an indictment. The affair ended when Nancy realized Brancusi did not need her. He did not need anyone. His work was enough, complete unto itself, and her presence was neither essential nor particularly welcome. She had been useful for a time. She bought wine, she was warm in his bed, she was quiet when he worked, but she was not necessary. When she stopped visiting, he did not ask why. After Brancusi came a succession of others, quicker, less defined. A poet named Michael Arlen, who would later write popular novels and forget her completely. A Spanish painter who drank even more than she did and disappeared back to Barcelona without saying goodbye. An American writer who stayed in Paris for 3 months and treated her as an amusing interlude, a story he would tell at parties. Nancy began to see the pattern. She chose men who could not love her, or would not, or did not know how. She chose men who were absorbed in their work, their art, their own interior lives. She offered herself as supporter, muse, patron, lover, whatever role seemed required, and each time the same result. She was welcomed temporarily, used affectionately, and then, when something more important arrived, or when her usefulness expired, released. She told herself this was freedom. She told herself that casual affairs, relationships without obligation, were what modern women chose. She read about free love, about rejecting bourgeois marriage, about women who refused to be owned. She believed she was living according to those principles, but freedom was supposed to feel like something other than this constant searching, this endless offering of herself, this accumulation of departures. In 1924, she met Aldous Huxley. He was 30, already gaining recognition as a novelist, and he moved in the same circles Nancy did, literary, artistic, consciously intellectual. They had an affair that was more conversation than passion. Huxley talked about ideas the way other men talked about wine or women, with precision, detachment, and underlying certainty. Nancy listened and felt, again, that she was in the presence of someone who knew something she did not. But Huxley was married. His wife, Maria, knew about Nancy and did not seem particularly concerned. The marriage was unconventional, open in ways that middle-class England would not have tolerated, but that literary Paris accepted as sophisticated. Nancy was not a threat. She was an episode, interesting while it lasted, easily concluded when Huxley's interest moved elsewhere. When it ended, not dramatically, just a gradual decrease in meetings until they stopped entirely. Huxley wrote her a letter. It was kind, measured, the sort of letter one writes to a friend after a pleasant visit. He hoped she was well. He encouraged her to write, to do something with her intelligence. He suggested that perhaps she relied too much on the reflected light of others. The letter was meant generously, but Nancy read it as confirmation of what she had begun to suspect. She was a satellite, orbiting other people's work, other people's lives, generating no light of her own. She tried to write. She sat in cafes with a notebook, the way she had seen others do, and attempted poems, stories, anything that might prove she was more than just a wealthy woman spending time among artists. But the words came out flat, imitative, empty of the intensity she saw in the work of the people around her. She read what she had written and felt ashamed. She tore out the pages and left them on the table. By 1925, Nancy was 29. She had been in Paris for 6 years and had nothing to show for it except a series of ended affairs and a reputation for generosity that felt increasingly like currency. She bought drinks, hosted dinners, provided money when artists needed it. She was liked, welcomed, invited. But she was not taken seriously. The men she slept with did not consider her their equal. They considered her their patron, their temporary companion, their audience. And she had allowed this, had encouraged it, because being near their work felt closer to having her own than the emptiness of not trying at all. She looked at herself in the mirror of her apartment and saw her mother. Not physically. Nancy was thinner, sharper, marked by late nights and too much wine. But in function. Emerald had collected artists and basked in their reflected glory. Nancy was doing the same thing, just with younger men and cheaper wine. The rebellion she thought she had staged was not a rebellion at all. It was an inheritance. She needed to do something different. She did not know what yet, but the weight of her uselessness had become unbearable. The men she chose kept showing her the same truth. She was beautiful, she was wealthy, she was available. She was not necessary. In 1928, Nancy founded a publishing house, not in Paris, but in a village outside Rouen called Rayonville, where she had rented a small farmhouse. She called it the Hours Press, named after the medieval books of hours she had seen in museums. The name suggested something ancient, careful, sacred. The reality was a converted stable with a hand-operated printing press she barely knew how to use. She had bought the press in Paris from an American who was giving up on his own publishing venture and returning home. The machine was a Mathieu, heavy, iron, temperamental. It took 3 men to transport it to Rayonville and install it in the stable. Nancy hired a young man named Maurice to teach her how to operate it, how to set type, how to ink the plates without smudging. Maurice was patient, methodical, and treated Nancy like a student rather than an employer. She appreciated this for approximately 2 weeks, until the difficulty of the work made his patience feel like condescension. The first book she printed was a collection of poems by George Moore, her mother's former lover, the man who had made Nancy uncomfortable throughout her adolescence. The choice was not sentimental. Moore was established, respected, and his name would lend credibility to the Hours Press. Nancy set the type herself, letter by letter, a process that took weeks. Her fingers cramped. Her back ached from bending over the press. The first attempts were disasters, smudged ink, uneven pressure, pages that had to be thrown away. But she persisted, and by summer she had produced 50 copies of Moore's Pironic the Fool. The books were beautiful in the way handmade things are beautiful, imperfect, individual, touched by human effort. And Nancy sent copies to reviewers, to bookshops, to friends in the literary world. The response was polite. People admired the craftsmanship. They noted the Hours Press as a curiosity, a vanity project, something a wealthy woman with time and money might do. No one took it seriously as a commercial enterprise. Nancy told herself she did not care about commercial success. The Hours Press was about art, about beauty, about preserving work that mattered. But she did care. She wanted recognition. She wanted people to see her as more than a patron, more than a wealthy dilettante playing at work that others did out of necessity. She printed more books, poems by Richard Aldington, by Norman Douglas, by writers who were respected but not widely read. She worked long hours in the stable, her hands stained with ink, her clothes smudged. She began to understand something about labor that she had never needed to understand before. It was exhausting. It was repetitive. It occupied your body and your attention in ways that left you depleted. The artists she had admired for years worked like this constantly, without trust funds, without the option to stop when it became tedious. But Nancy could stop. That was the difference, and everyone knew it. When the press broke down, which it did repeatedly, she paid Maurice to fix it. When she needed supplies, she ordered them from Paris without checking prices. When winter came and the stable was too cold to work in, she simply closed the press for several months and returned to Paris. The work was real, but the consequences of failure were not. In 1929, she printed Samuel Beckett's first book, Horoscope. Beckett was 23, unknown, and Nancy had met him through friends in Paris. The poem was strange, difficult, full of obscure references to Descartes. Nancy liked it because it was uncompromising, because it would not find a publisher anywhere else, because printing it felt like supporting real art rather than commercially viable work. Horoscope won a small prize and brought some attention to the Hours Press. Literary magazines mentioned it. A few critics wrote appreciatively about Nancy's taste, her willingness to take risks on new writers. Nancy felt briefly that she had accomplished something meaningful, but the feeling did not last. The book sold fewer than 100 copies. Beckett remained unknown, and Nancy remained primarily identified as the wealthy woman who ran a small press in France, not as an artist herself. She began drinking more heavily, not at the press. She could not operate the machinery while drunk, but in the evenings, back at the farmhouse. She drank wine, then cognac, then whatever was available. The farmhouse was isolated, and Nancy spent long nights alone, drinking and reading the work she was printing, comparing it to the poems she had tried to write and abandoned. The gap between what she wanted to create and what she was capable of creating felt insurmountable. By 1930, the Hour's press had published about 15 books. Nancy had put thousands of pounds into it, far more than the press would ever earn back. She had worked physically harder than she had worked at anything in her life. She had developed real skill with the printing press, had learned typography, had gained an education in publishing that few people bothered to acquire. But none of it made her an artist. She was still just a facilitator, still orbiting other people's work. The recognition she received was always qualified. Reviews praised her dedication and her generosity, words that emphasized her money rather than her judgment or skill. She was described as a patron who happened to do the printing herself, rather than as a publisher in her own right. The distinction mattered to her more than she admitted. She wanted to be necessary to literature, not just adjacent to it. She printed a book of her own poems in 1930. She did not announce that she was the author. The book was published anonymously, credited only to a lady. The poems were short, imagistic, influenced by the surrealists she had known in Paris. They were not terrible, but they were not distinctive either. They sounded like poems written by someone who had read a great deal of poetry without having much to say themselves. No one reviewed the book. It sold fewer than 20 copies. Nancy never acknowledged publicly that she had written it, and after a few months, she destroyed the remaining inventory. The failure confirmed what she had feared. She had taste, she had intelligence, she had access to the literary world. But she did not have talent, not the kind that mattered. The Hour's press continued for another year, but Nancy's commitment to it had weakened. She still printed books, still worked the press, but the initial excitement had curdled into routine, and routine without financial necessity felt like performance. She was performing the role of a serious publisher, performing the role of a working woman, performing a life that had meaning. In 1931, she sold the press. She told friends she needed to focus on other projects, that the Hour's press had accomplished what she intended. But the truth was simpler and more painful. She had tried to create something that would outlast her presence, something that would prove she was more than her money and her connections. And she had failed. The work she had published would survive, some of it. But her role in its survival would be forgotten, reduced to a footnote, a curiosity. The Hour's press had given her something to do. It had not given her what she wanted. Nancy met Henry Crowder in Venice in the summer of 1928 at a party on the terrace of a palazzo overlooking the Grand Canal. He was playing piano with a small jazz ensemble hired to entertain guests who had traveled from across Europe for the season. He was 32, black, American, from Georgia originally, and he played with the kind of competence that allowed him to work steadily without drawing particular attention. Nancy stood near the piano for most of the evening, drinking champagne and watching his hands move across the keys. She approached him after the performance. Not unusual, wealthy patrons often spoke to musicians they liked, offered compliments, sometimes commissions. But Nancy did not compliment his playing. She asked where he was staying, how long he would be in Venice, whether he knew Paris. Henry answered carefully. He had learned to navigate conversations with white women who had money and took interest. The interest was rarely about music. They began an affair within a week. Nancy invited him to dinners, to her hotel, to daylight hours when he was not working. She was not subtle about it, did not attempt to hide what was happening. The other guests at the palazzo noticed. Some found it amusing, others distasteful. But Venice in 1928 permitted certain liberties that London would not have, as long as it stayed within the bounds of the season, within the temporary suspension of rules that defined vacation. It could be tolerated. But Nancy did not treat it as temporary. When she returned to Paris in September, Henry came with her. She installed him in her apartment on the Ile Saint-Louis, bought him clothes, introduced him to her friends. The response was immediate and varied. Some of the artists and writers she knew, those who prided themselves on progressive politics, welcomed Henry with performative enthusiasm. They asked him about jazz, about America, about race, as though his presence confirmed their own enlightenment. Others stopped inviting Nancy to gatherings, stopped responding to her letters. The lines were drawn quickly, quietly, and without explanation. Nancy did not care, or told herself she did not care. She had spent years seeking acceptance from people who bored her, people who valued propriety over authenticity. Henry was different. He was not interested in her money, or rather, he was interested in it the way anyone without money is interested in it, practically rather than romantically. He did not write poems about her. He did not pretend she was his muse. He was with her because she paid his rent, and because the arrangement worked for him. The honesty of it felt cleaner than the dishonesty she had experienced with other men. But there were complications. Henry had a wife in the United States, a woman he had not seen in years, but had never divorced. He had a life before Nancy, a life shaped by poverty and racism and the kind of constant navigation that Nancy had never had to perform. She began to understand that his presence in her apartment, in her bed, in her life, carried risks for him that it did not carry for her. She could be scandalous. He could be arrested. In 1929, Nancy brought Henry to London. She told her mother in advance, not asking permission, but informing her of a fact. Emerald's response came in a telegram. "Do not bring that man to this house." Nancy brought him anyway. They stayed at a hotel, not at Grosvenor Square, but Nancy made certain they were seen, at restaurants, at theaters, at parties where people she had grown up with would notice and report back. The reaction was severe. Emerald sent a lawyer with a letter that outlined the family's position. If Nancy continued this relationship, she would be cut off financially. Not immediately, not completely. The trust was irrevocable. But her mother would cease all contact, would ensure that Nancy was excluded from family events, would make certain that everyone in their social circle knew that Nancy Cunard had disgraced herself beyond redemption. Nancy read the letter in her hotel room while Henry was out walking. She read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in her suitcase. That evening, she took Henry to dinner at the Savoy. They sat in the main dining room, visible to everyone, and Nancy ordered champagne. People stared. Conversations stopped at nearby tables. Nancy smiled at Henry across the table and felt something that was not quite happiness, but was close to it. The satisfaction of having finally done something her mother could not forgive. But what Nancy experienced as liberation, Henry experienced as danger. He was careful in London in ways he did not have to be in Paris. He watched who was watching them. He modulated his voice in public, his movements, his expressions. Nancy noticed this and felt a brief stab of something like guilt, but she did not change course. She needed this relationship to mean something larger than itself, to be about freedom, about defying convention, about standing against racism and classism and all the structures she had been trying to escape since childhood. The problem was that Henry had not asked to carry that weight. He was a musician trying to survive, trying to navigate a world that gave him limited options. Nancy was using their relationship to make a point, to wage a war against her mother and her class, and Henry was the weapon she had chosen. He understood this, though they never spoke about it directly. He stayed because the financial security Nancy offered was real, because Paris was better than Georgia, because the affair had become something he could not easily leave without consequences. They returned to Paris in the autumn of 1929. Nancy threw herself into activism she had previously ignored. She began reading about race in America, about colonialism, about the intellectual and artistic movements emerging from black communities. She attended lectures, sought out black writers and artists in Paris, began planning what would become her most significant project, an anthology of black writing, art, and political thought. But her interest, however genuine, was tangled with other motivations. She wanted to prove something to her mother, to the people who had rejected her, to herself. She wanted to be on the right side of history, to be remembered as someone who had fought against injustice. The work she was beginning to do was important, but it was also inescapably about her, her redemption, her legacy, her need to matter. Henry continued playing piano at clubs in Montparnasse. He came home late, smelling of smoke and whiskey, and found Nancy awake, reading, drinking, surrounded by papers and books. She talked about the anthology, about the racism she was learning to recognize, about the urgency of the work. Henry listened and said little. He had been living with racism his entire life. Nancy had just discovered it, and her discovery felt like ownership, like she had found something new rather than something that had always been there. The relationship would last 3 years. But the pattern was already established. Nancy loving Henry in ways that served her own needs, Henry accepting it because the alternative was worse, both of them trapped in roles they had not fully chosen, performing a romance that was also a statement, also a weapon, also a trap. In 1931, Nancy began work on what would become Negro, an anthology. She had spent 2 years reading W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, Jean Toomer, and had become convinced that white ignorance about black culture and political struggle was not just unfortunate, but criminal. She wanted to create something comprehensive, something that would force white readers to confront realities they had been permitted to ignore. The project consumed her in ways the hour's press never had. This felt urgent, righteous, necessary. She wrote to writers and scholars across America, the Caribbean, and Africa, requesting contributions. She asked for essays, poems, music transcriptions, and anthropological studies, political manifestos. She wanted the anthology to cover everything: history, art, music, contemporary politics, the African diaspora, colonialism. The scope was enormous, possibly unmanageable, but Nancy pursued it with the intensity of someone who believed they had found their purpose. Many people responded. Some were enthusiastic, grateful that a white woman with money and connections was willing to use both for this project. Others were cautious, wondering what Nancy's motivations were, whether she could be trusted to handle the material responsibly. A few declined outright, uncomfortable with the idea of a white English aristocrat positioning herself as the curator of black culture. Nancy did not question her right to do this work. She had Henry, which in her mind granted her a kind of authority. She was not just an outsider looking in. She was personally connected, intimately involved. She told people this, used her relationship as credentials. Henry said nothing when she did this, but his silence had weight. He had become, without explicitly consenting to it, proof of Nancy's legitimacy. The anthology grew. Nancy worked obsessively, editing submissions, soliciting new contributions, writing her own essays about racism and colonialism. Her writing was passionate, angry, full of the fervor of the recently converted. She condemned the British Empire, American segregation, European colonialism. She wrote about lynchings, about economic exploitation, about the violence that white supremacy required to sustain itself. None of her analysis was wrong exactly, but it carried the certainty of someone who had just learned these things and assumed they were the first to truly understand them. She included an essay about her own family's racism, about her mother's reaction to Henry, about the ways wealthy white families maintain their status through exclusion and control. The essay was brave in some ways. She was risking whatever remained of her connection to her family, but it was also self-serving. Nancy positioned herself as the hero of the story, the one who had broken free, who had chosen love and justice over inheritance and respectability. She did not mention that she continued to live on the money that inheritance provided. By 1932, the anthology was nearly complete. Nancy had collected over 250 pages of material from more than 150 contributors. It was ambitious, sprawling, uneven in quality, but undeniably significant. She found a publisher in London, Wishart and Company, who agreed to print it. The book would be expensive, over 800 pages, with illustrations and music examples. Nancy paid for much of the production costs herself. Her mother learned about the anthology through the London literary press. Emerald was livid, but her anger was not about the book's content. She hadn't read it and wouldn't read it. Her anger was about the public humiliation, about Nancy's continued insistence on associating with Henry, about the family name being connected to what Emerald saw as racial agitation. She sent another letter through her lawyer, more severe than the first. This time, there was no threat of being cut off. The language was simpler. Nancy was no longer welcome at any property owned by the family. Emerald would not speak to her, would not acknowledge her, would not respond to any communication. Nancy was effectively disowned. Nancy received the letter in Paris and felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was pain, despite everything, despite years of neglect and rejection, Some part of her had still wanted her mother's approval. But there was also satisfaction. She had finally done something unforgivable. She had finally pushed far enough that there was no path back. The possibility of reconciliation, which had haunted her with its impossible promise, was gone. She was free of it, but the freedom was not clean. Negro was published in February 1934, after years of delays and complications. The reviews were mixed. Some praised Nancy's commitment, her willingness to use her privilege and platform for social justice. Others criticized the anthology's organization, its lack of coherence, the way it seemed to treat Black culture as a monolith, rather than recognizing its internal diversity and complexity. Several Black critics noted carefully that Nancy's own essays displayed the kind of paternalism they were supposedly challenging, a white savior narrative dressed up in progressive language. Nancy did not respond well to criticism. She had worked for years on Negro, had put her own money into it, had sacrificed her relationship with her family for it. She believed she deserved gratitude, not critique. When Langston Hughes wrote a review that praised the anthology but questioned some of Nancy's editorial choices, she fired off an angry letter accusing him of ingratitude. Hughes did not respond. The anthology sold poorly. It was too expensive, too long, too academic for popular readers, and too uneven for scholars. Nancy had hoped it would spark a movement, force conversations, change minds. Instead, it disappeared quietly into library collections and the shelves of a few dedicated readers. The impact Nancy had envisioned did not materialize. Her relationship with Henry was deteriorating. They had been together for nearly 6 years, but the initial attraction had long since been replaced by routine, dependency, and resentment. Henry wanted to return to music full-time, to tour, to work without being defined by his relationship with Nancy. Nancy wanted him to stay, to validate the choices she had made, to prove that everything she had sacrificed had been worth it. They fought more frequently. Nancy drank more heavily. She accused Henry of not appreciating what she had done for him, for his career, for the cause of racial justice. Henry pointed out with increasing directness that he had never asked to be a symbol, had never wanted to be the proof of Nancy's political awakening. He had wanted a relationship, and instead, he had gotten a mission. In 1935, Henry left. He moved out of Nancy's apartment, returned to performing in clubs, eventually went back to the United States. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final argument. He simply stopped being available, stopped returning to the apartment, stopped participating in the life Nancy had constructed around him. She tried to convince him to stay, wrote letters that oscillated between pleading and accusation, but he did not respond. Nancy was 39 years old, alone in Paris with an anthology that had failed to change the world and a mother who would never speak to her again. She had been right about racism, about colonialism, about the structures of power that maintained white supremacy. But being right had not made her necessary. It had not made her less alone. She looked at Negro on her bookshelf and saw years of work, genuine conviction, and a deeper truth she did not want to acknowledge. She had used the suffering of others to give her own life meaning. The cause was just. Her participation in it had been compromised from the beginning. In July 1936, military forces under General Francisco Franco launched a coup against Spain's elected Republican government. By August, the country had collapsed into civil war. Nationalists backed by Hitler and Mussolini against Republicans supported by the Soviet Union and international volunteers. Nancy, reading about it in Paris, saw clarity she had been missing since Henry left. This was not complicated. This was not morally ambiguous. This was fascism against democracy, and she knew which side required her. She traveled to Spain in September as a journalist, though she had never written journalism before. She carried press credentials arranged through contacts in Paris, a camera she barely knew how to use, and a conviction that her presence mattered. She told friends she was going to document the war, to tell the truth that establishment papers were ignoring. She believed this. She also needed to be part of something larger than her own dissolving life. She arrived in Barcelona first, then moved to Madrid, which was under siege by nationalist forces. The city was being shelled daily. Food was scarce. People were dying, soldiers and civilians both, in numbers that grew every week. Nancy stayed in a hotel near the center, in a room that shook when artillery hit nearby buildings. She went out during the day with her camera, photographing destroyed streets, refugees, Republican soldiers. She wrote articles and sent them back to papers in England and France. Some were published, most were not. Her writing was passionate but unfocused, full of outrage without analysis. She described what she saw: the destruction, the suffering, the determination of Republican forces, but she did not have the training or the detachment to make sense of it. Her articles read like testimonials, like conversion narratives. She had found the righteous war she had been looking for. But righteousness did not protect her from what she was witnessing. Madrid in 1936 was genuinely dangerous, genuinely desperate. Nancy had never experienced anything like it. She had read about war, had volunteered in hospitals during the last one, but this was different. This was immediate, inescapable, random. Shells landed without warning. Buildings collapsed. Bodies were pulled from rubble. The violence was not abstract or distant. It was occurring in the streets where she walked. She met other foreign journalists and volunteers, writers, photographers, political activists who had come to support the Republic. Many were communists or socialists, committed to ideologies Nancy only partially understood. She attended meetings, listened to debates about strategy and theory, tried to participate, but she was out of her depth. These people had been organizing, studying, fighting for years. Nancy had been reading about injustice for a few years and had published an anthology. The difference showed. She began drinking more, partly from stress, partly from habit, partly because alcohol was one of the few things still relatively available in besieged Madrid. She drank in the evenings with other journalists, sitting in hotel bars while the shelling continued outside. They talked about the war, about politics, about who was winning and what it meant. Nancy talked too much, drank too much, repeated herself. People began avoiding her. She stayed in Spain for 3 months on that first trip. She photographed and wrote and bore witness, and all of it felt inadequate. The scale of suffering was too large, the stakes too high, and Nancy's contribution, a few published articles, some photographs that captured nothing essential, seemed trivial. She wanted to matter here, wanted her presence to make a difference, but the war did not need her. It needed soldiers, weapons, food, strategic competence. It did not need a wealthy Englishwoman with a camera and good intentions. She returned to Paris in December and immediately began planning to go back. Her friends tried to dissuade her. The war was getting worse, Madrid might fall, the conditions were unbearable. Nancy dismissed their concerns. She was needed in Spain, she insisted. Someone had to tell the truth about what was happening. When people pointed out that many journalists were already doing that work, Nancy grew defensive. They did not understand. They were not committed the way she was committed. She went back to Spain in early 1937, this time staying for 6 months. The siege of Madrid continued. The city was starving, its infrastructure collapsing, its population exhausted. Nancy moved through it in a state of constant agitation, drinking, photographing, writing articles that grew increasingly incoherent. She was not eating enough, not sleeping enough, not taking care of herself in any meaningful way. She had affairs with several men during this period: Republican soldiers, fellow journalists, volunteers from England and America. The affairs were brief, intense, and forgettable. Nancy was seeking something in them, some confirmation that she was alive, that she mattered, that she was not just witnessing horror, but experiencing it. The men obliged, briefly, and moved on to more pressing concerns. There was a war happening. Personal drama was a luxury no one could afford. By summer 1937, Nancy's mental state had deteriorated noticeably. She was paranoid, erratic, convinced that people were talking about her, that she was being followed. Some of this was plausible. There were spies in Madrid, informants, danger everywhere. But much of it was the product of exhaustion, alcohol, and psychological collapse. She accused people of betraying the cause, of being fascist sympathizers, of lying to her. Her friends in Madrid began to distance themselves quietly, the way people do when someone is falling apart and cannot be helped. She returned to Paris in August, thinner, sick, unable to explain clearly what she had accomplished in Spain. She had published a handful of articles. She had taken photographs that mostly showed rubble and distant smoke. She had witnessed suffering without alleviating it, documented atrocities without preventing them. She had wanted to be useful, and instead she had simply been there, another foreigner extracting experience from other people's tragedy. But Nancy told herself a different story. She told herself she had fought fascism, that she had risked her life for the cause, that her work in Spain had mattered. She needed to believe this because the alternative, that she had used the Spanish Civil War the same way she had used Henry, as a vehicle for her own redemption, was unbearable. The war continued without her. Madrid would hold out for 2 more years before falling to Franco's forces in 1939. Thousands more would die. The Republic would lose, and Nancy would be in Paris, drinking in her apartment, looking at photographs of destroyed buildings, and trying to remember why she had been there, what she had thought she would accomplish, what she had believed about herself that the war had failed to confirm. She had wanted to be a soldier, a journalist, a witness who mattered. She had been a tourist in other people's catastrophe, privileged enough to leave when it became too difficult, wealthy enough to survive her own collapse. The Spanish Civil War had not needed Nancy Cunard, but Nancy Cunard had desperately needed the Spanish Civil War, and that need had accomplished nothing except her own further unraveling. Nancy returned to London in 1939, just before Germany invaded Poland. She had not been back to England in any sustained way since her mother had disowned her 5 years earlier. She arrived with no clear plan, no place to stay, and a growing sense that something inside her had broken in Spain and would not repair itself. She rented a small flat in Bloomsbury and tried to resume a life she could no longer remember how to live. The war changed everything and nothing. London prepared for bombardment, sandbags, blackout curtains, evacuation plans. Nancy registered for volunteer work, but was rejected from most positions. She was 43, had no relevant skills, and her reputation had preceded her. The organizations that might have used her during the last war wanted nothing to do with her now. She was known as difficult, unreliable, a woman who drank too much and caused problems. She volunteered at a canteen serving tea to soldiers, work that required no expertise and no trust. After Emerald's death, Nancy left London. She could not articulate why, but the city had become unbearable, too full of memories, too full of people who had known her before, who could measure the distance between what she had been and what she had become. She returned to France in 1949 to a small farmhouse in La Motte-Fenelon in the Dordogne. It was isolated, cheap, far from Paris and the literary circles she had once moved through. She told no one she was leaving. The farmhouse had 3 rooms, stone walls, no central heating. Nancy filled it with objects she had collected over decades, African sculpture and masks from her work on Negro, books in multiple languages that she no longer read, photographs she could not bear to look at but could not throw away. The accumulation was not decorative. It was evidence of a life she needed to prove had happened, had meant something. She lived alone. There were neighbors, farmers, a few other expatriates who had chosen rural France for their own unspoken reasons, but Nancy did not befriend them. She spoke to them when necessary, at the market, at the post office, brief exchanges that revealed nothing. They knew she was English, that she had money from somewhere, that she drank. That was enough. The drinking had become the organizing principle of her days. She woke and drank to steady herself. She drank through the afternoon to maintain a baseline level of intoxication. She drank in the evenings until she passed out. The quantities were staggering. Bottles of wine, cheap cognac, whatever was available. Her body had adapted in ways that allowed her to consume amounts that would kill someone unaccustomed to them, but the adaptation was not protection. It was just a slower form of the same ending. Her appearance had deteriorated beyond what alcohol alone could explain. She was emaciated, her skin yellowish, her hair thin and unwashed. She wore the same clothes for weeks, did not bathe regularly, let the farmhouse fill with unwashed dishes and empty bottles. She had stopped caring about the things that had once mattered to her: beauty, presentation, the image she projected. Or perhaps she was punishing herself, performing degradation as penance for failures she could not name. She received money monthly from the trust, and she spent it on alcohol and the minimum required for survival. She did not buy new clothes when the old ones wore out. She did not repair the roof when it leaked. She ate irregularly, usually bread and whatever required no preparation. Her body was consuming itself. burning through reserves that had long since been depleted. In 1951, she had a fall. She was walking from the farmhouse to the road and lost her balance, drunk, malnourished, dizzy from standing too quickly. She broke her wrist. A neighbor found her hours later, helped her to the local doctor, who set the bone and said things Nancy did not listen to about her health, her drinking, the trajectory she was on. The wrist healed poorly, left her with limited mobility in her left hand. She learned to pour with her right. Letters arrived occasionally from old friends who did not know she had left London, who wrote to her last known address and had mail forwarded. Nancy read them sometimes, but rarely responded. The letters asked how she was, what she was working on, whether she might visit. They were kind, concerned, and Nancy could not bear them. Kindness required acknowledgement of her condition, and acknowledgement required honesty she did not have. She tried periodically to write. She would sit at the table with paper and pen and attempt to record something. Memories of Paris, analysis of the failures of the Spanish Republic, thoughts about race and colonialism. But the alcohol had damaged her cognitively in ways she could not fully recognize. Her thoughts were fragmented, her handwriting illegible, her ability to sustain an argument across multiple pages gone. She would write a paragraph, read it back, and find it incomprehensible. She blamed her eyes, the light, the quality of the paper. She did not blame the vodka she was drinking while trying to write. The paranoia that had begun in Spain intensified. She believed neighbors were stealing from her, though nothing was missing. She believed people were entering the farmhouse when she slept, moving things, watching her. She would wake in the night, certain someone was there, and find the house empty. The isolation fed the paranoia, and the paranoia justified the isolation. She could not trust anyone, and therefore she could not let anyone close. In 1953, she attacked someone. A man in the village, someone she barely knew, had said something she interpreted as an insult about England, about the war, about expatriates. Nancy followed him out of the shop where they had encountered each other and began shouting, then struck him. She was 57 years old, weighed perhaps 90 pounds, and the physical damage she could inflict was minimal. But the man called the police, and Nancy spent a night in a cell before being released with a warning. The incident confirmed what the villagers had suspected. She was not eccentric. She was dangerous, unstable, to be avoided. Her health continued its decline. She developed infections that lasted for weeks, stomach problems that left her unable to eat even when she wanted to, a cough that suggested something serious in her lungs. She did not see doctors unless forced. She did not trust them or claim not to trust them. But the truth was simpler. She knew what they would say, and she had no intention of following their advice. By 1955, Nancy was bedridden for weeks at a time. She would rally briefly, get up, go to the village, buy supplies, and then collapse again into fever, pain, confusion. During these periods, she hallucinated. She saw her mother standing at the foot of the bed watching without speaking. She saw Henry, younger than he had been when they were together, playing piano in the corner of the room. She saw soldiers from Madrid, bleeding, asking her for help. She could not give. She was dying slowly, without witnesses, in a farmhouse in rural France. She had money enough to survive, but not enough to matter. She had work behind her. Negro, the Hours Press, articles from Spain, but no work ahead. She had outlived her friendships, her relationships, her reputation. What remained was just the waiting, the drinking, the slow surrender to consequences that had been accumulating for decades. The farmhouse walls were thick stone, built to last centuries. Nancy would not last the decade. She knew this in moments of clarity, when the alcohol wore off enough to let reality through. But clarity was painful, and she had become expert at avoiding it. She drank, and she waited, and she let the days pass without marking them, without counting, without hoping they would add up to anything except their own eventual end. The 1950s arrived, and Nancy remained in London, moving between cheap flats in Bloomsbury and Fitzrovia as landlords lost patience with her. She was evicted 4 times between 1950 and 1955, for unpaid rent, for disturbances, for the condition she left apartments in. Each move reduced her circumstances further. The flats grew smaller, dirtier, located in buildings where no one asked questions as long as the rent eventually arrived. She had started talking to herself, not occasionally, not muttering under her breath, but conducting full conversations with people who were not there. She argued with her mother, with Henry, with writers she had published, with men she had loved decades earlier. The arguments were loud, profane, conducted at all hours. Neighbors complained. Nancy did not care or did not hear them. The boundary between interior and exterior, between thought and speech, had become porous. Her appearance had deteriorated past the point where eccentricity could explain it. She was skeletal now, her clothes filthy, her hair unwashed and matted. She had stopped bathing regularly, stopped changing clothes. She smelled of alcohol, of unwashed skin, of decay. When she went out, which was less and less frequently, people moved away from her on the street. Shopkeepers watched her carefully, worried she might steal or cause a scene. She was becoming one of those women people crossed the street to avoid. The drinking was constant. She woke and drank through the day, drank until she passed out at night. The trust money continued to arrive. Not much, but enough to sustain her existence, and she spent it almost entirely on alcohol. Gin, mostly, because it was cheap and effective. She stopped eating regular meals. Food became an afterthought, something she remembered occasionally and resented having to think about. She began injuring herself, small cuts at first, on her arms and hands, wounds she did not remember acquiring, then larger injuries, burns from cigarettes dropped while she was passed out, bruises from falls, a broken wrist from walking into a doorframe. She did not seek medical attention for most of these. Pain had become ambient, unremarkable, just another condition of being alive. In 1954, she was arrested for assault. She had attacked a woman in a pub, someone who had said something Nancy interpreted as an insult. The details were unclear. Nancy's account did not match witnesses' accounts, and she could not remember the incident clearly the next day. She spent 2 nights in jail before someone from the trust arranged her release. The charges were dropped, but the incident was noted. Nancy Cunard was violent now, dangerous, someone the authorities would be watching. The paranoia had deepened. She believed people were following her, listening to her conversations, going through her belongings. Some of this may have been true. She owed money to various people, had made enemies, and London in the 1950s was full of people who noticed when someone from a wealthy family was vulnerable. But most of it was delusion, the product of alcohol-damaged cognition and isolation. She trusted no one, suspected everyone, lashed out preemptively. She wrote letters that were never sent, pages of accusations and manifestos that she began but could not finish. Her handwriting had become nearly illegible, the words crowding together, lines written over other lines, margins filled with notes that connected to nothing. She kept these papers in piles around her flat, stacks that grew but were never organized, never reread. They were evidence of something, she believed, though she could not have said what. The few people who still tried to help her found it impossible. A former friend from the Paris years visited in 1955 and was horrified by what she found. Nancy incoherent, living in squalor, clearly ill. She tried to arrange for medical care, for proper housing, for intervention. Nancy refused everything, accused her of being a spy, of working with her mother's estate to steal from her. The friend left and did not return. Nancy fell again in 1956, this time breaking her hip. She was taken to hospital where doctors discovered the extent of the damage. Severe malnutrition, liver disease, infections that had gone untreated for months. They kept her for 6 weeks trying to stabilize her, but Nancy was an impossible patient. She refused medications, pulled out IV lines, tried to leave against medical advice. She was hostile to nurses, accused doctors of poisoning her, screamed until other patients complained. When she was finally discharged, she returned to a flat she could barely afford and resumed drinking immediately. The broken hip had not healed properly. She had refused to do the physical therapy, and she walked with a severe limp now, using a cane she resented. Mobility became difficult, then dangerous. She fell repeatedly, injuring herself further each time. The isolation was nearly total by now. No friends visited, no family acknowledged her existence. The only people she saw regularly were landlords demanding rent, shopkeepers she bought alcohol from, occasionally a social worker who checked on her and documented her decline for bureaucratic purposes. Nancy lived alone with her memories and her rage and the voices she argued with in the empty rooms. She thought often about Henry, about Spain, about the hour's press, about all the things she had tried to do that had not worked. The memories were fragmentary, unreliable, but they were all she had. She told stories to herself about her life, stories that grew more dramatic with each retelling, until she could not separate what had happened from what she wished had happened. She had fought fascism. She had published important writers. She had defied her class. These things were true, but they had not meant what she thought they would mean. They had not saved her. In 1959, she was found unconscious in her flat by a landlord who had come to demand 3 months of back rent. She was hospitalized again, this time for alcohol-induced seizures. The doctors said she was dying, that her organs were failing, that she needed to stop drinking, or she would not survive another year. Nancy signed herself out of the hospital after 4 days and went home and drank. She was 63 years old. She had outlived most of her generation, the writers and artists she had known in Paris, the men she had loved, the enemies she had made. She had survived wars, survived her mother, survived decades of self-destruction. But survival was not the same as living. She was alive in the technical sense only. Everything else had ended years ago, and what remained was just the slow mechanical conclusion of a body that did not know how to stop. The letter from the solicitor arrived in 1960, 12 years after Emerald's death, but Nancy had stopped opening official mail years earlier. It sat in a pile near her door for weeks, buried under unpaid bills and notices of eviction. When she finally opened it, drunk, on an afternoon she would not remember clearly, she learned that there had been a miscalculation in the estate. A small bequest had been overlooked, a secondary provision that her mother had not thought to remove. Nancy was entitled to a sum of money, not large, but substantial. The solicitor required her signature to release the funds. Nancy read the letter 3 times. Then she tore it in half. She did not want her mother's money. She had lived without it for 14 years before Emerald died, had lived without it for 12 years since. The trust from her grandfather was enough, barely, but enough. To accept anything from Emerald's estate felt like capitulation, like admitting that she had been wrong, that the rebellion had been a mistake, that she should have stayed quiet and obedient and taken what was offered. But the solicitor was persistent. More letters arrived, then a visit to her flat. A young man in a suit who looked around the room with barely concealed horror before explaining that the money would be released to her whether she cooperated or not, but that her signature would make the process simpler. Nancy told him to leave. She told him in language that made him retreat quickly, stammering apologies. The money arrived anyway, deposited into her account without her consent. She checked her balance at a bank one afternoon and saw the increase. Several £1,000s, more than she had seen in years. She stood at the counter and felt a wave of rage so intense she had to grip the edge to keep from falling. Her mother had found a way to reach her even from death, had found a way to prove that Nancy still needed her, still depended on the family money, still could not survive without the structures she had spent her life claiming to reject. Nancy withdrew the entire amount in cash. The bank manager tried to dissuade her. It was dangerous, unnecessary. Could she not simply leave it in the account and withdraw as needed? Nancy refused. She wanted it out, wanted it in her hands where she could see it, control it, decide what happened to it. She carried the money home in her handbag and spent the next 3 days deciding what to do with it. She counted it repeatedly, stacked it in piles on her table, held the bills up to the light as though they might be counterfeit. The money was real. It was her mother's money, and it was in her flat, and she did not want it. She began giving it away, not to charities, not to organizations. Those would have been rational choices, and Nancy was no longer thinking rationally. She gave it to people on the street, to beggars, to prostitutes, to drunks she met in pubs. She pressed bills into their hands and told them it was from her mother, that it was cursed, that they should spend it quickly before it poisoned them. Most people took the money without question. Some looked at her with concern or pity. Nancy did not care. She gave money to her landlord, months of rent in advance, more than she owed. She gave money to shopkeepers for debts she did not actually have. She bought rounds of drinks for entire pubs, for people she did not know, and when the money ran out sooner than she expected, she felt relief. The money was gone. Her mother's final claim on her was spent, dissipated, wasted on strangers who would forget her by morning. But something had broken in the process. Whatever restraint Nancy had maintained, whatever thin membrane had separated her decline from total collapse, had torn. She had rejected her mother's money, had thrown it away deliberately, dramatically, and the gesture had accomplished nothing. Emerald was still dead. Nancy was still alone. The money had been a test, and Nancy had failed it by carrying it all, by letting it matter enough to stage a rejection. She stopped paying rent again. The advance she had given her landlord ran out, and when he came for more, Nancy screamed at him that she had no money, that she had given it all away, that he should ask her dead mother for it. He evicted her. It took 3 months and a court order, but eventually bailiffs arrived and removed her from the flat. They put her belongings, piles of papers, dirty clothes, empty bottles, into boxes and left them on the street. Nancy stood on the pavement and watched strangers pick through her possessions. They took what looked valuable or useful and left the rest. The papers, the letters, the photographs from Spain, all of it was abandoned, trampled, eventually swept away. Nancy watched this happen and did not intervene. It seemed appropriate. Her life had been reduced to trash on a London street, and strangers were deciding what was worth keeping. She found another flat, smaller, in a building where the landlord did not check references or ask questions. The room had a bed, a table, a sink, no private bathroom. The toilet was shared with 3 other rooms, down the hall. Nancy moved in with what remained of her belongings and tried to remember why she had wanted to survive. The incident with her mother's money had clarified something. Nancy had spent decades believing she was fighting against her family, against her class, against the structures that had shaped her. But she had never actually escaped them. She had lived on family money her entire life. She had used that money to fund her rebellions, to publish her press, to travel to Spain, to survive her own self-destruction. The rebellion had been subsidized by the thing she claimed to be rebelling against. She had become her mother in the worst possible way. Not successful like Emerald, not socially powerful, but dependent on wealth she had not earned, spending money that came from sources she despised, unable to function without the very systems she condemned. The difference was that Emerald had used the money to build something, to create a life of significance, however morally compromised. Nancy had used it to destroy herself, slowly, expensively, over decades. She sat in her new flat, smaller than a servant's room at Neville Holt, and drank from a bottle she could barely afford. Her mother's money was gone. Her mother was gone. And Nancy remained, alive for no clear reason, carrying nothing forward, preserved by the same wealth she had wasted her life pretending to reject. Nancy left London in 1960, not because she wanted to, but because staying had become impossible. She had exhausted the city, exhausted its landlords, its patience, its willingness to tolerate her. Someone, a former acquaintance whose name she could not remember, suggested she try France. Paris was out of the question. She had burned those connections years ago, but perhaps somewhere quieter, somewhere she could afford, somewhere far from anyone who knew her. She found a small farmhouse in La Motte-Fenelon, in the Dordogne region of southwestern France. The house was old, barely maintained, with stone walls and a roof that leaked. It cost almost nothing to rent because almost no one wanted it. There was no electricity, no indoor plumbing, no heat except a fireplace that Nancy rarely bothered to light. She moved in with 2 suitcases and a trunk of books she no longer read. The isolation was total. The nearest village was 2 miles away, accessible only by a dirt road that became impassable when it rained. Nancy had no car, could not have driven one if she did. She walked to the village when she needed supplies, mostly alcohol, and the villagers watched her with the careful neutrality people reserve for foreigners who might be dangerous or mad. They sold her what she wanted and did not ask questions. She filled the farmhouse with objects from her past, African sculptures and masks she had collected during her years with Henry, artifacts that had once meant something about her commitment to racial justice, and now were just things gathering dust in corners. She arranged them throughout the rooms, on shelves, on the floor, hung on walls, creating a museum to a version of herself that no longer existed. The masks watched her with empty eyes. Nancy talked to them sometimes, explaining herself, justifying decisions made decades earlier. The drinking was killing her, but slowly. She drank from the moment she woke until she passed out, usually on the floor because reaching the bed required more effort than she could sustain. Her body had begun to shut down in visible ways. Her hands shook constantly. Her skin had taken on a yellowish cast, jaundice from liver failure. She vomited blood occasionally, though not enough to stop her from drinking afterward. She had stopped caring for herself in any meaningful way. She wore the same clothes for weeks, did not wash, did not eat unless hunger became painful enough to override the nausea. The farmhouse filled with garbage, empty bottles, rotting food, piles of unwashed clothes. Mice moved through the rooms at night. Nancy could hear them, but did not bother setting traps. They were just other inhabitants of the space, no more or less welcome than she was. Time became unreliable. Days blurred together, unmarked by routine or obligation. Nancy lost track of dates, seasons, years. She thought it was 1963, but could not be certain. She thought she was 67, but might have been older. She had stopped receiving mail, had no calendar, had no way of marking time's passage except through the physical evidence of her own deterioration. She fell frequently. The stone floors were unforgiving, and her bones had become brittle from malnutrition and alcohol. She broke ribs, fractured her wrist again, split her head open on the corner of a table. She did not seek medical attention. The nearest doctor was in the village, and the idea of walking 2 miles, of explaining herself, of submitting to examination and judgment, it was unthinkable. She bandaged what she could reach and ignored the rest. She thought about death constantly, but did not pursue it actively. She was killing herself through drinking and neglect, but that was different from choosing to die. It was passive, incremental, something that was happening to her rather than something she was doing. The distinction mattered to her, though she could not have explained why. She wrote occasionally, or tried to. She had paper, had pens, but her hands shook too badly to form legible words. She would start a sentence about Spain, about Henry, about her mother, and lose the thought midway through. The pages accumulated, covered in fragments, half-formed accusations, beginnings without middles or ends. She kept them in a box that she never looked through. They were proof that she had tried to say something, even if the something remained forever unsaid. She had visitors exactly twice during the 4 years she lived in the farmhouse. The first was a journalist from England who had heard she was still alive and wanted to interview her about the hour's press, about her work in the 1920s and 30s. Nancy refused to see him. She shouted at him through the closed door until he left. The second was a local woman from the village who had been sent by the priest to check on her welfare. Nancy let her in, mostly because she was too weak to refuse. The woman looked around the farmhouse at the filth and the African masks, and Nancy herself, skeletal, yellow, shaking, and left without saying much. Nancy never saw her again. In early 1965, Nancy stopped being able to walk. Her legs simply ceased to function reliably. She could stand sometimes with support, but walking more than a few steps was impossible. She crawled when she needed to move around the farmhouse, dragging herself across the stone floors to reach the toilet, the fireplace, the bottles she kept in the kitchen. She lay on the floor for hours, sometimes days, staring at the ceiling and thinking about very little. Her mind had begun to fail along with her body. Memories surfaced randomly, disconnected from chronology. Her father's hounds at Neville Holt, the printing press in Rayonville, Henry's hands on the piano, shells landing in Madrid. The memories carried no emotional weight anymore. They were just images, scenes from someone else's life. She stopped eating entirely sometime in February or March. She could not remember the last meal she had prepared, the last time she had been hungry. She drank because the body's need for liquid persisted even when hunger disappeared, but she drank only alcohol. Water tasted wrong, made her nauseous. The alcohol was easier, familiar, and it did not matter now what damage it caused. On March 16, 1965, Nancy Cunard died alone in the farmhouse in La Motte-Fenelon. She was 69 years old. Her body was not discovered for 3 days, until the landlord came to collect rent and found her on the floor near the fireplace, surrounded by empty bottles and African masks. The cause of death was listed as malnutrition and alcohol-related organ failure, though pneumonia had likely contributed, along with a dozen other complications. There was no funeral. Her body was cremated at the nearest facility, and the ashes were buried in a local cemetery without ceremony. The few possessions in the farmhouse, the African art, the books, the boxes of incoherent papers, were dispersed, sold, or thrown away. Nothing remained to mark that Nancy Cunard had lived there, had died there, had spent her final years in conscious, deliberate self-destruction. The farmhouse was rented to someone else within the month. Nancy Cunard left behind an anthology that sits in university libraries, unread except by specialists. She left behind a small press that published Samuel Beckett's first book, a fact mentioned in footnotes. She left behind photographs of a war she witnessed but could not affect, articles that were published and forgotten, relationships that ended badly or simply ended, the wealth that shaped her entire life, that paid for her education, her travels, her press, her rebellions, her decades of self-destruction, came from ships that carried people and cargo across the Atlantic. Her grandfather built an empire moving things from one place to another. Nancy spent her life trying to move herself away from that empire and never succeeded. The money followed her to Paris, to Spain, to the farmhouse in France. It kept her alive long enough to destroy herself completely. She fought against racism in ways that were genuine and ways that were self-serving, often simultaneously. She published black writers when few others would, and she used their work to wage a private war against her mother. She lived with Henry Crowder and loved him, probably, but also used him as proof of her own virtue. The contradictions do not cancel each other out. They simply coexist, unresolved. Her mother wanted to be remembered for her salons, her patronage of the arts, her place in society. She was, for a time. Nancy wanted to be remembered for her resistance, her courage, her refusal to comply. She is remembered barely by people who study the margins of literary history, the footnotes of modernism. What Nancy wanted most, to matter, to be necessary, to create something that would justify her existence, remained always just beyond reach. She tried art, activism, love, rebellion. None of it was enough, or she was never enough for it. The farmhouse in La Motte-Fenelon still stands. It has been renovated, modernized, rented to tourists who do not know that Nancy Cunard died there. The African masks are scattered across museums and private collections, their provenance forgotten. The Hours Press books are rare now, valuable to collectors, unread. She was born into everything and died with nothing, and somewhere between those 2 points was a life that no amount of wealth could fix and no amount of rebellion could redeem.